Welcome, one and all, to my presentation on nonviolent communication, the Trivium, natural law, and the human potential movement. This will be part one of a three-part series.
Because we're going to show you today how to use this technology. And with this technology, it will be impossible for you to hear criticism. With these ears, all you can hear is the only thing human beings are ever saying. Please and thank you. We're going to show you today that all what used to sound like criticism, judgments, blame, are simply tragic, suicidal expressions of peace.
For those of you new to my channel, some of my work is dedicated to deconstructing the false ideologies and belief systems that prevent people from gaining the knowledge of natural law. This may offend some people who are attached to these particular ideologies. Therefore, this is my disclaimer. This will be the first presentation in a new education series that will be going into depth on the topics of philosophy, psychology, and science in the context of our current conditions and, of course, natural law. Today's presentation will be about philosophy, extending into psychology. And just to update, I'm still finishing this monstrous book project, so the Natural Law Essay and Critique series is put on hold, which will be mostly about philosophy. We have to have the metaphysical basics understood so that true psychology and true science can emerge. If you haven't been to the What on Earth is Happening podcast, it is greatly recommended. Mark has aggregated a vast amount of research into a simple framework that would save anyone decades and more of time.
Freedom, man. That's what it's all about.
Also, if you have benefited from Mark's material, consider making a donation. Just letting you know I'm not affiliated, but recognize the tremendous value here. Before we begin, a few notes. Two terms need to be defined, and the last one specified. First is the term proxy, which means a substitute, false version, that which takes the place of something real. This could be called the reversal of meaning, as used in mind control. For example, man's law is a proxy for natural law. Part of the reason why people fall for false ideologies is because it mimics a partial truth. This is essentially what deception is. Next is apophysis, which is a method of inquiry to arrive at truth by eliminating known negatives, to understand what something is by what it is not. Affirmation through negation. Finally is the term or terms New Age postmodernism, which will be sometimes used as broad general categories, including many ideologies of the 20th century. Of course, a deeper analysis would differentiate between the various schools and camps, but all have the same underlying basis. In reference to the conditions of human slavery that all systems of false authority generate will be clips from the 1984 movie based on Orwell's book. We live during the times of the apocalypse, when spiritual knowledge has been publicly revealed. This is the era of de-occultation. The control system of human slavery has been de-occulted, revealing itself to be an immoral system of masters and slaves, operating through moral relativism, ignorance, apathy, and non-holistic dualistic consciousness. Also de-occulted is the infinite all, in which everything comes from, and its natural laws behind creation, a metaphysical necessity for the existence of objective truth and morality. Natural law is a body of knowledge consisting of various aspects that need to be understood individually and as a whole in order to attain holistic consciousness. This is no easy work. In addition to outward extensive study, the process of initiation regards internal work. People who haven't done the work on themselves will find it difficult to receive truth as their worldview structure actively fights against it. Prior to the difficult task of gaining spiritual knowledge is apophysis, the process of eliminating all false ideologies, religions, and belief systems that modern education has socially conditioned us with. Through correspondence, knowledge of the cosmos relates to self-knowledge, and we integrate the two through action. Besides the task of gaining knowledge, one must develop epistemological methods for truth discovery in the application of philosophy, which means learning the basics of language, as general grammar, and the categories and processes of logical thought with the Trivium. This task is very critical, which most postmodern philosophies deliberately complexify and obscure. In fact, the destruction of language can be easily seen with the overly intellectualized relativism of modern linguistics and general semantics. Gaining knowledge is only the beginning, as next we face the task of understanding, which regards psychological apophysis and inner work, alchemy, redemption, identifying correcting errors or immoral thoughts, feelings, and actions, deep self-reflection and receptivity to higher truth, the contemplative inner dialectical method, learning the purpose and mastery over the emotions, with the integration of knowledge into our emotions. After understanding, mind and heart must now integrate with action as expression. When we are attempting to speak and share truth with others, we are now engaged in the great work, in which we are in the communal space of interaction. Before we continue speaking about the great work, let's summarize the fact that we have described the archetypal threefold Trivium process of knowledge, information, understanding, processing, and wisdom, action. A multidimensional, linear, and nonlinear process in which we gather information about the world, assimilate it, and then take action. During the final steps of this takes great psychological understanding, sensitivity to emotional nuance, and communication skills. Thus, it is no surprise that many Trivium users and individuals who see the value of methodology, grammar, logic, and rhetoric to ascertain objective truth have found the need to incorporate the emotional aspects of reality.
Tonight on History So It Doesn't Repeat, we feature a presentation by Tragedy and Hope researcher Daryl Becker, discovering how to formulate effective critical thinking and empathetic communication skills, and how by carefully selecting our words, we can all be the change we want to see in the world. Learning's the answer. What's the question? It's all coming up next on History So It Doesn't Repeat.
Several years ago, there was a movement to combine NVC, nonviolent communication, with the Trivium. Nonviolent communication takes us back to a model developed in the 1960s by Marshall Rosenberg, a model that lives well today, having been developed in 60 countries. Here's a clip from his seminar that gives you some of the basic assumptions of the NVC worldview.
A student in my class incessantly talks loud, won't stay seated, or keep his hands to himself.
I hear about 3 judgments in there.
Okay, since coming to the introductory presentation on Tuesday night, I've been very aware of hearing evaluations
Yes.
in myself and especially in other people. And so I started to wonder, are all of those violent communications, or would there be a way that some of those are, according to this model, nonviolent?
I would say that any evaluation of others that implies wrongness is a tragic expression of an unmet need. Tragic in the sense, for 2 reasons. First, it decreases the likelihood that we will get what we want. Even if we don't say it out loud, even if we think it, if we are even thinking that what somebody else does is wrong, it decreases the likelihood that we will get what we want. And second, it increases the likelihood of violence. So what could be more tragic than that, than expressing ourselves in a way that gets in the way of our getting what we want and increases violence?
The reason for the union between NVC and the Trivium is that many recognize the imbalances that occurs with a strong emphasis on logic, which can be alienating and exclusive, which ignores our need for human connection. In a sense, this was a drive to be more holistic in the use of the Trivium, if even unconsciously, but this movement never truly reconciled the division between mind and emotion or deocculted their relationship that natural law is central to. Recently, the NVC debate has resurfaced with the natural law community, as we never got to the root issues. Because I did not find an adequate presentation on YouTube, and individuals in the community were seeking more information, I decided to make this video and will attempt to deconstruct this topic using the Trivium and natural law to be as close to objective truth as possible. When talking about the mind and emotion, we speak of the masculine and feminine, and so let's recap the birth of the truth community and the value of true freedom. After the feminization of the New Age, there was a strong necessary wave of the sacred masculine, calling out New Age bullshit and the feminine fallacies that prioritize feeling good over objective truth. But for those who have debunked the false spirituality of the New Age with natural law, there is another ego trap in the identification with spiritual knowledge that can cause blindness and promote pride, superiority, elitism, and self-righteousness. Hypercritical judgment can be reductionistic in the land of complex psychology, and can fuel what holds us back from evolution when reinforcing ego and shadow, the two things we must continually refine. Here we emphasize the spirit, which correlates to the feminine emotion, and is just as important as the mind. Getting our spirit in alignment with objective good is incredibly important. One can have natural law knowledge while being self-destructive when the mind is not balanced with the spirit, but we don't want the sick feminine spirit of the New Age. Having the spirit of empathy and communion with others without being alienated by our knowledge is the next step for the initiates of natural law. Thus, it is understandable as to why the subject of NVC has reemerged as an archetypal desire to get in touch with the sacred feminine. The correct feminine spirit is the big picture understanding that we are one, and that we have been everything which we criticize. The evolutionary journey is from the lowest demon to the infinite all, and we are all of it. Therefore, judgment and compassion merely reflect self-knowledge and self-understanding, not war and condemnation. Holistic consciousness is not about sacrificing the masculine for the feminine or vice versa. It is about the dynamic interchange of both in their healthy state. And that's a Walter Russell reference for you. The principle of gender is the fundamental polarity that creates all matter, in which movement, expansion, and contraction of the physical world are based on, as the mental and spiritual are embodied in the physical. When the masculine doesn't have the feminine, it is too restricted, operating in a closed loop with myopic vision, in which one cannot grow. But when the feminine doesn't have the masculine, it is too fallacious, insincere, ambiguous, and chaotic. Yes, the feminine has the desire of connection, but if it's not based in truth, then such a desire will merely project false connection. We have to seek truth and the connection to the infinite all within before we can really have true connections with others. Our understanding of the feminine and our feminine expressions should never violate logic or reason, while our masculine expressions need to include the range of emotions with the flexibility of multiple contexts. Attaining unity consciousness means to synthesize emotions and the mind as to base both on objective truth and morality. When the emotions come into alignment with truth, they become the intuitive detectors for greater levels of reality that logic alone cannot observe, as to even help logic expand. In this presentation, we will only scratch the surface of the relationship between mind and emotion. Before we start, it is important to discuss the relationship between the Trivium and natural law, since there has definitely been a strong divide in the truth community with the formation of these two camps. Even though Richard Grove of Tragedy and Hope helped Mark Passio record the Natural Law Seminar, you will find his podcast and others of a similar nature, like the School Sucks Project, rarely discuss natural law. The reason is that natural law regards occult and esoteric topics of spiritual principles, the evolution and psychology of consciousness, reality creation, more than just a basic rational understanding of anarchy, law, and logical principles of exoteric philosophy. Ultimately, both go together. Natural law involves topics like holistic consciousness, metaphysics, the divine origin, transformation of consciousness through refined ego and shadow. The ego and shadow never go away until they return to the all, but become more refined over time. This is evolution. An understanding of the archetypes, as fear, ego, and shadow are merely the polarity of love, self, and the all, the apophysis of. The various archetypes of mother, feminine, father, masculine, and child integration. There is also the 9 spiritual laws, the 7 hermetic, including origin and care. Many in the Trivium camp generally do not have knowledge, understanding of, or desire to explore these topics due to their materialist paradigm that considers metaphysics to be either a belief or speculation. They know that objective facts exist in the world and are cognizant of some kind of conspiracy, but not of the metaphysical principles of consciousness that actually create the world. Materialists usually reduce the multidimensional infinite reality to the finite physical realm. Finite in that while its manifestation has no physical end and beginning, it is still a temporal plane, one out of innumerably many that we merely pass through. Their concerns are only material, as they do not seek to understand the nature, structure, and purpose of the universe as a multidimensional whole. To them, man's logical mind is merely an epiphenomenon, when to the light occultists, the logical mind of man merely corresponds to the divine reason of law. Many in the Trivium group seek to apply logic to our daily experience for self-interest, rather than uncover knowledge of consciousness and the deeper purpose of existence. They desire the logical tools, like the Trivium, for survival and personal gain, but are not ready to penetrate the deeper mysteries that overturn the materialist way of living, which is actually what needs to happen to dissolve the control system. Pragmatism, like all false ideologies, is related to Satanism and its worship of ego, selfishness, and self-serving achievement. But when we pursue unholy things like climbing up the dominator hierarchy of status, fame, money, pride, and narcissism, we contribute to the control system and slavery as a whole. Freedom and evolution require objective morality.
Well, like, what is Satanism, like, really?
I mean, to me, it's a logical format of exactly how to fundamentally get the most out of life without any kind of dogma, superstition, fear, or anything else controlling you. It's you being completely in control of your universe.
What could be more tragic than that, than expressing ourselves in a way that gets in the way of our getting what we want?
If you can, developing the practice of asking yourself those two questions before you talk to anyone about anything. What am I trying to get out of this, and is the approach I'm using effective at getting me there? And you'd be amazed how much of the conversation you have in your life is just out of habit, and you're using completely ineffective methods to get out of the conversation what it is you're trying to get out of it.
You can start to do this interactively and greatly improve your certainty in your decision making and judgments in life, which leads to satisfaction, because whether or not we're satisfied has to do with whether or not we understand our environment. This is also the source of self-confidence. If you understand your environment at any given time, you're going to have a high rate of self-confidence because you know how to get things done and you're familiar with your environment, where to get the resources, how to put them together, and how to actually make fire or get food or any of these needs that we need to have satisfied, these primary motivations.
Those in the Trivium camp that do not understand natural law can only base their metaphysics in relativism, thus supporting game theory, pragmatism, utilitarianism, and consequentialism, with a desire to optimize or maximize what is personally advantageous in each moment using various tools. Ironically, this is the same metaphysical basis for the topics we will be discussing, like the New Age counterculture of the 1960s and the human potential movement, which birthed and cultivated nonviolent communication. The human potential movement has a feminine and masculine side. The feminine side was about creating safe and supportive communities based in so-called spiritual New Agey beliefs, which is where NVC fits in, while the masculine side was to use spiritual truths for success and self-actualization, as Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich utilizes the law of mind. Regarding the masculine side, along with positive thinking and NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, there was a rise in pyramid sales, get-rich-quick schemes, and the business of self-help gurus like Anthony Robbins, who has a net worth of $500 million. We also have Oprah and her net worth of $3.2 billion, and the movie The Secret, of which focus on getting what you want in the name of spirituality. In The Secret, the law of attraction is a total distortion of true natural laws. This movie exemplifies the combination of the New Age, self-help, achievement, success, and ego fulfillment. However, in reality, it is much more common that material sacrifices are required for true spiritual advancement, as the evolution of consciousness and the progress of materialism are mostly opposite. The pursuit of money is actually false enlightenment, as it places your time and attention on a dead object rather than the living truth of reality. Because we live in a capitalist system of codependency, our interactions are corrupted with inauthenticity and the compromises of integrity and ethics for business and affiliation. We are dependent on each other for survival, and this biases our perception of reality. when we should be aligned to truth, to come together as our basis, we instead make each other the truth in some type of regressive tribalism. Our social persona and ego become the same. Social skills are desirable, for at the least, they grant survival and financial security, and at the most, wealth and status. This reflects the false morality that the entire control system is run on, in which doing what is right is doing whatever is right for you, whatever is right for me. But this is antithesis to objective morality. Being in truth and in the right can have serious material and social sacrifices, even though high spiritual gains, as courage is a virtue, to be cultivated, simply because the structure of the world is opposed to true philosophy. Indeed, speaking the truth is a revolutionary act. Nonviolent communication is about connection, and one who does not understand objective morality can seek a connection with others for these purposes, which is why it is so effective in the realm of media, advertisement, business, and the art of manipulation. With the rise of all topics New Age and self-development, individuals can now make a living if they created a sustainable crowd, and sadly, this would often turn into charlatans and false gurus of cults, as in our capitalist pragmatic system, this is what has worked. People want to live off their ideas and so seek a way to sell them, but ultimately this turns humans into objects to exploit and resources to control.
I see the Master as the divine, yes, I do.
He is the divine himself.
I can only tell you.
Many in the Trivium camp also desired to incorporate tools for self-development and emotional wellness, like the School Sex Camp, with the 6 pillars of self-esteem. But just like the self-help of the New Age movement, development here is based in pragmatism over metaphysics, thus offering little in terms of true evolution of consciousness. While the Trivium camp fares better, way better than the extreme solipsism of most of the New Age crowd, they are still motivated by the same materialistic drives, as all higher drives of reason and spirit would lead them to natural law. Thus, they can only end in a cul-de-sac of relativism, as to use discernment of particular objective facts for their own self-serving, unexamined agendas, but to never get to the heart of things. Ironically, going all the way with the relativistic, materialist, pragmatic paradigm brings us to the dark occultists of the control system, who have done just that. They are winning the material game because they have created the game's rules that we blindly follow under the trance of authority. They create money out of nothing and are therefore on top of the money game. They create government through mind control. They are the system engineers that design the system that we take as objective reality, when in fact it is an immoral human creation. They are the extreme pragmatists who have worked their way up the knowledge hierarchy and the false dominator hierarchy of power. They have done the work to create that very illusory concept of the dominator hierarchy itself with dark sorcery. But often you will find most logical pragmatists struggle to go all the way with their dark side, like these dark occultists, which their pragmatic philosophy would actually rationalize. If selling out brings desirable consequences, then why not? Yet deep in the unconscious, people know that pragmatic ideology is rotten to the core. Without investigation, those intuitive enough can glimpse the soul, knowing that the objective higher good for morality must exist, that can absolutely not be based on the ego. Much more information on these topics will be presented in my upcoming book, especially how and why spirituality is integral to philosophy, and how these ideologies of pragmatism, utilitarianism, and consequentialism are ultimately relativistic, as beneficial consequences can occur with immoral action. For now, I hope the basic differences between the Trivium group and the Natural Law group are more clear. While some people may think that such a broad generalization removes the individual, or that this discussion of division actually creates the division, when speaking of groups, we are merely speaking of general worldviews, and I am polarizing the worldviews to show the spectrum of movement from ideology to true philosophy. The gap between the materialists and those who know that spirituality is a fact of reality is the general divide of humanity, as those who engage in false spirituality are actually materialists as well. Furthermore, observing the divide is not creating one. Natural law philosophy will indeed divide in as many ways as people have misunderstandings and are inwardly divided. The natural law group will eventually be co-opted, as all groups are. Regardless, the truth exists and will be found by those who cultivate the courage, care, and will to gain it, as it requires no group and is about the individual and his connection to the all. In terms of the philosophical relationship between natural law and the trivium, natural law can be considered metaphysics, what is, while the trivium is epistemology and methodology, how we know. Methodology could be considered a subset of epistemology. Epistemology is built on metaphysics as the method to know what is. Natural law regards the origin, the absolute, the axioms and principles of what is that can be discovered as the anchor for all specific truths determined in the relative dimension. Without metaphysics, using the trivium would have no solid foundation. For example, the law of identity has to be rooted in the absolute identity of all existence, the infinite all itself. Without that, nothing can be what it is. Yet it takes holistic consciousness to understand such a difficult truth, for it is holistic. It's not just logic. It's logic and intuition. If we do not know that truth and morality are objective and independent from man's perception, then we cannot use the trivium accurately. But in order to fully grasp the objectivity of reality and morality, one must go through the alchemical transformation from being ego-identified to being truth-seeking, since the ego creates a relativistic worldview that preferences itself.
Say the need. Learn a need consciousness, which is what we're going to get to now. That's how we evaluate in nonviolent communication. We evaluate from the heart, from the heart, from the heart. We make judgments, but we make need-serving judgments. We judge whether what people are doing is meeting needs or not. We don't moralistically judge the person for what they did. We judge whether it's serving life or not, because needs are our direct connection with life.
The desire to integrate the Trivium and NVC was started by Daryl Becker and Tony Myers and their work with Richard Groves from Tragedy and Hope, published in 2013. I want to begin by saying that the intention behind this is good, as these students of logic desire to be more integrative and whole by investigating the emotional side. But until you exit out of the pragmatic relativistic worldview, one's intentions cannot be truly correct. And relativists will instantly object that there is a correct alignment for the feelings. Now, Daryl Becker and Tony Meyer contrast somewhat with the hardcore empiricist Trivium users like Bill Jocelyn, who end up criticizing Daryl Becker's NVC Trivium synthesis with Gnostic media. And this was presented in 2015. We are going to critique both perspectives. The problem is that what Daryl describes as NVC isn't NVC anymore, as he has reframed it from an entirely new perspective. Here he describes it with the school sex project.
The reason why I put such value into nonviolent communication as a tactic and started to break it down and look at the components and then present it a la Trivium style with you and also with Richard Grove was that I saw these as tools. I was hoping other people would see these things as tools, meaning there's an individual and very specific application whenever you're dealing with a tool. A tool is something that's designed by the person who's using it, and then it's applied, and then things happen. So what gets brought up in these Gnostic media productions are very important, often proclaimed concerns and claims made by other people regarding their own interactions with proponents of nonviolent communication. That's very important and real. I think that these are real, I would say, concerns that are brought up by people who are encountering other people using these skill sets. And what I'm advocating personally is very different, or I would say at least slightly different, to sometimes even radically different from what many NVC users are doing. So that's my little intro to this whole thing.
Could you just expand on that a little bit when you say somewhat different to radically different? Like when we look at the traditional NVC model, or I hate to call it a script, but I did see a lot of people simply trying to use it as kind of this Mad Lib script originally. And I'm not saying that everybody that I encounter that uses NVC is doing that today. But when you talk about your departure, I mean, we're going to get into it more as the production goes on, but just to preview it, what would be the nature of your departure from traditional nonviolent communication?
Okay, to summarize that, it would be an emphasis upon internal application It would be an emphasis on my own equilibrium, since I'm going to try to speak in I statements. When I'm using these tools, I'm using it just to gain a good stance emotionally. I'm using them to potentially enhance my own trivium, which is the other part, the objective. So a lot of NVC is, the way it's generally taught, is huge amounts towards emotional literacy, towards identifying feelings that are going on, especially other people's feelings, to identify the motives that cause those feelings, such as values and desires, and they call them needs. I would depart by not calling them needs to people who are not trained in NVC. I would depart by very much emphasizing the 4Ds of disconnected communication. I depart by also translating those 4Ds into likely values and desires, the motives behind the utilization of any of the 4Ds, so that I can then from there take it down a notch. So I'm not then feeling the tension that happens, or that would say the tension that happens automatically when I'm getting a demand, when I'm getting an unrequested diagnosis of myself, when I'm receiving deserve-oriented language, when I'm hearing a denial of responsibility.
Here, Becker describes his departure from NVC as a tool to be applied internally to find inner equilibrium, to cultivate a good emotional stance in emotional literacy, as a tool to reduce tension when someone talks to you harmfully. Essentially, Becker desires to use this new version of NVC for the purpose of inner work in self-knowledge, in awareness of the emotional landscape for both self and other. While what he describes is very important, this is no longer NVC. But unfortunately, postmodern relativism gave the impression that everything is up for interpretation and that there is no originally correct interpretation of anything. Here, Tony Myers adds his take on NVC.
Well, just to jump on something what Daryl said, NVC is multidimensional. It's an analytical tool. It's a rhetorical tool. It's even a sort of a general grammar tool, sort of categorizing our initial sense perception and trying to understand some of the feelings that arise from that and some of our motivations for action based on those feelings, so forth and so on. So it's not just, I think what Daryl was describing was intention, when his intentions were pure and he's trying to be honest with himself and when he uses it with other people.
Myers describes NVC as an analytical tool and a tool for understanding one's emotions and motivations. We will see how this completely changes the original tenets of NVC. The pro-NVC Trivium camps see that emotions and feelings are part of grammar, which indeed they are, and we will get into this. But NVC is a worldview with particular tenets that do not cohere with this. There cannot be a true debate unless each camp agrees on what the subject of the debate is. The first step of having shared definitions, which in this case is agreeing upon the fundamental tenets of NVC. Some of these tenets were given here by Bill Jocelyn in his debate against combining NVC and the Trivium.
So the next slide. I have a syllogism here that's quite long, which is how these ideas, dominator culture, leads into NVC. Okay? All human behavior is an attempt to fulfill needs. All human needs are universal, therefore they're never in conflict. Conflict rises from competing strategies for meeting needs. Violence is a strategy for meeting needs. Violence is learned culturally, so enter cybernetics. Colonial structures are dominator cultures based in violence. Dominator cultures use coercive language to enslave. The enslaved perpetuate the masters by the use of that language. Changing the language changes the culture from dominator to partner. So here's the thing. Are these premises true? How do we know if they're true? How can we falsify? How can we vet and ensure that they're true? Are they rooted in reality?
The funniest one is dominator cultures use coercive language to enslave. Well, what is NVC and NLP but coercive language?
Coercive language, that's right. So again, what this goes down to, we have a whole bunch of ideas that spin off of a core assumption that somebody has defined a priori and then applied it to history, applied it to observations in reality. So we had charts in the last presentation that went from axioms, precepts, concepts, and so on. Right. This is the next slide, by the way. So I'm going to show how these ideas stack up against that. Are we building out of reality into higher level concepts and these concepts valid, or are we not? Okay, so
while Jocelyn is able to elucidate the NVC tenets, which gives us a clearer picture of the debate, and while he knows they are indeed false tenets, he cannot explain why, and this is because he merely falsifies them for being a priori principles, as he believes all principles other than objective reality exists are false principles, which places him as a moral relativist, like the logical positivists and empiricists. He fails to realize that the principles of reality are much more than objective reality exists independent of man's perceptions, as these principles must, by necessity, go into the nature of reality and the structure of reality itself, including mentalism, origin, polarity, morality, consciousness, and evolution. Jocelyn is stuck. Thus, one cannot deconstruct invalid a priori principles unless you have the right a priori principles of natural law, as a priori principles are not the problem, the wrong ones are. Jocelyn believes that we can only understand reality through basic sensory observations and facts, but this is anti-holistic. Holistic consciousness can also understand general principles from the top down, through rational intuition. Truth is not only ascertained from the bottom up, otherwise we would never arrive at the principles of reality. There is also a major error in this diagram. While Jocelyn correctly perceives that this model on the right is incorrect, in which language creates reality, his model on the left is also problematic. While he builds up from reality and abstracts language from reality, he considers the higher levels of conceptual language to be derived from language itself. When higher order concepts also exist in objective reality in which language corresponds. He doesn't understand the law of mind. So let's turn to the tenets of NVC, which are indeed false universals. Its basic assumption is that we are all compassionate by nature and that violence, verbal or physical, is learned by culture. Here's the simplistic dichotomy that man is good and culture is evil, when the creation of immoral culture is the creation from the immorality in man. Through law of correspondence, collective evil is the product of individual evil in the aggregate. Metaphysically speaking, the moral polarity of good and evil exists both in man as potential and free will and manifestation, as to deny this is to abdicate responsibility. Could we even call this blame language, or the language of the denial of responsibility? We'll get to these terms soon. It is insidious to believe that not only is the basic motivation behind everyone the same, but that it is basically good, as this makes human beings blind to their own moral polarity and the moral polarity in others, the inward evil and of the shadow. This is antithesis to true self-awareness. When one assumes that one is good, there can be no real evolutionary growth, as the path towards goodness is through apophysis and from becoming aware of its opposite. In fact, this is the ideology of a predator that would have you believe that predators don't exist.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
This belief makes people blind to the satanic cult that rules the world. Besides the evil in average people, it is dangerous evil in sociopaths and psychopaths who have little to no empathy and compassion. The alchemical process of transformation requires that we confront our own evil and expose the evil and shadow, which block the light as to refine it so that more light can come in. To see humans as only good is the positive bias of the New Age, thinking that perception is reality, and if one ignores the negative doesn't exist. The next tenet is, all human needs are universal and therefore never in conflict. The definition of need is very vague here. As in a relativistic paradigm, there is no distinction between real and false needs. Needs can actually be created by impulse and addiction, as the advertisement industry is so committed to. While basic human needs are water, food, and shelter, when we discuss emotional needs, we get into tricky territory, as many emotional needs are indicative of the lack of sovereignty. Most needy people are usually codependent. Of course, children need good parenting, which most don't get. This is why our needs as adults often become unresolved childhood issues and the inner compulsions of the fragmented self. Need can easily become egoic desires, like the need for attention, which many New Agers say, "I need to be seen and heard." There is nothing in NVC about fulfilling needs and taking care of oneself to become a sovereign adult. Needs easily can become any feeling or deficiency and lack from the inside, which makes inner work imperative. But we will see how NVC and its related ideologies are about spiritual bypass for instant gratification. Moreover, besides the vast amount of things that can be called needs and aren't really needs, even legitimate needs can fluctuate in each and every moment and can be different for everyone. NVC desires to find universals, but ends up making what is different for each erroneously the same for all. Natural laws apply to all, but in correspondence to their individuality. Universals exist in the structure of reality and of self, both being consciousness, when its content and expression are different, as each individual is a unique aspect of the all, and in the context of time in a different phase of their evolutionary process. Everyone has thoughts, feelings, and emotions, but what they are relative to their level of being. Because NVC is rooted in false universals, it easily becomes a form of collectivism. NVC states that our main need is for connection. This is obviously related to the need to be social. And this becomes problematic because until we are really working on ourselves, we cannot have true and good connections. While we can connect when we share an experience, our need for connection can easily become the need for agreement, which we see in collectivist cults. And this is dangerous because not all perspectives are true. NVC fails to address the most important need, which is to have thoughts, feelings, and actions in alignment to truth and morality. Natural law. Without this, we are lost and cannot make meaning to discern what a true need is, and what a good intention is, and what a true connection is, and what good behavior is. The sure way to create self-destruction and become victimized in relationships is to revolve reality around one's confusing and unexamined emotions, and deny the importance of objective truth and morality. True connection is often spontaneous and unplanned, as it is authentic and not contrived. Connection with others should not be our first principle, as false connections can be created. Connection rests in truth, and not vice versa. All action and communication is driven to meet those needs. This is false as it denies the other aspects of communication that can be driven to share, learn, observe, teach, and inform. But ever since the destruction to the education system by postmodern New Age, the idea that knowledge exists and can be communicated would be turned into a myth. Such an assertion would even be considered to be oppressive. By getting people to be more subjective, without objective knowledge of language and logic, they would become better slaves for the controllers. The next tenet is, all conflict arises from competing strategies for meeting needs, violence being one of these strategies learned culturally. This again assumes that everyone's needs are good and that it is only their bad strategy that makes them bad, which avoids responsibility for one's dark side. It speaks nothing of attention, as one's intentions may not be good or pure. We will soon discuss why the term violence here is incorrect, as it is better to use the word harm. We can be harmful to each other in the ways that we communicate, but not violent unless our words are coupled with physical violence. It is not harmful language that makes us bad, it is the immorality of our character. But with MVC, we can never examine our character since our needs take primacy. If one says something mean to another person, then one can merely apologize for the mean language that failed to express his need for connection. There is never a true apology for the fact that one was mean due to the problem in his heart, mind, and soul. Again, no inner work. Following is the next tenet. Feeling helps us determine our needs. Once feelings and needs are identified and known, harmony can be achieved. Here we are conflating feelings and needs, as not all feelings are needs. Feelings have to be examined just like needs, and should not be accepted for face value as being appropriate. Often feelings can signify unresolved issues, like needs, and can merge with the ego. NVC desires to keep one identified and embedded in their emotional landscape, which creates great imbalance in a person, especially a person who has not yet developed their mind. We will look further into these topics. Metaphysics is the study of first principles. Once grasped, one is able to deconstruct false ideologies just by looking at their first principles or axioms, which are more accurately called tenets and assumptions. Some individuals believe that you have to have read Marshall's entire book to be able to criticize NVC, but a true philosopher understands that all you need is the fundamental principles, as all details in fleshing out a philosophy is based on those principles. I will be referring to various information on the internet and documents from the Nonviolent Communication website pertaining to Marshall's work. Returning back to the debate in the Trivium group, now with the understanding of the tenets of NVC, we can see why it is very problematic to reformulate prior ideologies, but maintain the name of those ideologies. And this is especially true for NVC, which came from the human potential movement with Esalen, that would spread like a virus into intentional communities as an ideological worldview. Besides the semantic issues, this reinventing old theories can encourage others to think that there is some validity in this exercise, which leads to various linguistic fallacies and contradictory living. Once we change the original tenets of an ideology, we should no longer carry the baggage or the ideology itself. NVC is not about emotional growth or self-examination. This is being projected by Mr. Becker and perhaps Meyer as well, as they assume that people are good and that their needs and feelings should be taken as truth automatically. NVC is not about exploring the causes, reasons, motivations behind needs, but acting on the assumption that all needs are valid and universal, which is not only an incorrect premise, but a dangerous belief that will actually sabotage relationships. Healthy relationships demand self-knowledge. When basing relationships on unexamined needs leads to emotional dependency. NVC and the Trivium are not compatible because the Trivium has the goal to discover truth, while NVC has the goal to meet unmet needs in communication. They overlap with the focus on communication, with the rhetoric of the Trivium, but they never surmount the problem that needs and truth can be incompatible and often are. This is why it is a common saying that the truth hurts when NVC is not interested in truth, but about making people feel good. NVC is a right-brain, imbalanced ideology connected with the feminization of culture through the New Age, and this is why it will be particularly attractive to women. It places feelings and needs at the center of everything. It is opposed to logic, discernment, direct confrontation, and to-the-point speech, which is part of the masculine. Catering to people's emotional needs outweighs objective truth. Therefore, NVC is an anti-evolutionary model that is based in the New Age belief that everyone is perfect just the way they are. This is pathological acceptance. We can see why some in the Trivium camp might see the Trivium as the masculine and NVC as the feminine, attempting to achieve balance through unification. But their fundamental axioms are opposed. Again, the true feminine is not opposed to the true masculine, or vice versa. And this is why it is important to talk about archetypes, gender in this case, rather than methodology meets one flawed ideology. The final tenet of NVC is that all communication is either through compassion, empathy, nonviolence or blame, moralistic judgment, and domination. Marshall Rosenberg calls nonviolent compassionate language giraffe language, and violent language jackal language. While giraffe comes from the heart and brings us together, the jackal comes from fear, guilt, and shame, and alienates us from each other.
And you know my giving isn't done to put you in my debt, but because I want to live the love I feel for you. And instead of playing the game that song is about, which I call Making Life Wonderful, it's the most fun game I've ever heard. Instead, much of the time we play another game called Who's Right? It's a game where everybody loses. So isn't this amazing that we all know about this quality of giving that the song was about? It's possible every moment. We find that the richest thing to do, and much of our life we end up playing Who's Right. Now the game of Who's Right involves two of the most devious things human beings have ever come upon. One, punishment. See, because if you're wrong in the game of Who's Right, then you deserve to suffer. So what is jackal language like? See, jackal language, as I mentioned, is a language of moralistic judgments. Think in terms of who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad.
Would you rather be right or happy? Well, how can you even discern a violent language from nonviolent language without being right about it? Is it not a good idea to think that someone is violating you when they are not violating you? It is very clear that Rosenberg labeling all moralistic judgments as bad is a contradiction, what Ayn Rand calls the fallacy of the stolen concept, since it is moralistic judgment to call moralistic judgments bad. How can violent communication be wrong when moralistic judgments are wrong? And this is the unavoidable hypocrisy of moral relativism. NVC, therefore, is entirely incompatible with the trivium in natural law and the primary axiom that reality and morality are objective. Furthermore, the claim that moralistic judgments lead to violence, as Rosenberg asserts, is not only a wrong assertion, but quite an evil one. Okay, so it might seem surprising that some in the Trivium camp were not able to spot this fundamental contradiction, but that is because they have not anchored objective morality as a first principle. Because much of the Trivium camp has a pragmatic relativistic ideology, they often cannot identify other morally relativistic ideologies. Even though NVC is based in moral relativism, it seeks to identify and define violence in language and harm in communication, but through zero theory and mental discernment, so that its basis is pure subjectivity. Interestingly, NVC distorts our understanding of morality so that right and wrong behavior becomes whether you are obeying the communicative rules of NVC right or not, wrong. And we will look at this later with the 4 Ds. For example, it is considered violent and wrong to confront people with moral judgment, but good if you confront them with your feelings about morality. In essence, this is saying that no one can ever do an actual wrong, but that they may hurt someone's feelings. While the integration between NVC and the Trivium occurred several years ago, today some seek to unify it with natural law, as they see the importance of applying morality to the intersubjective realm of communication and interaction. And hopefully this section will begin to clarify those issues. They interpret Rosenberg's claim that all moralistic judgments promote violence, which is completely antithesis to natural law, by differentiating between moral judgment and moral discernment. Yes, there is a difference there, and I will discuss this, but we must know that this differentiation was not made by Rosenberg. Before we continue, we must note that it is dangerous to corrupt the message of natural law by combining it with the New Age right-brain ideologies. If we lose our understanding of the importance of philosophical purity of natural law, or fail to develop that understanding in the first place, we can only descend into relativistic thinking and support others who are lost in that way of thought. When rhetoric is hijacked to serve an agenda, this can only lead to bad things. Those who have been initiated understand the high responsibility in using natural law language, and they will understand that what can be perceived as minor errors in thought can lead to significant regression in consciousness and behavior. My voice often quivers with this responsibility. Often the agenda behind combining natural law with previously held belief systems is to reconcile the past with the present, but sometimes the past needs to be left in the past when the method of growth should be apophysis, eliminating false beliefs rather than combining them with certain truths. When we eliminate mental contradictions, we become more free. It is always difficult to have one foot in one world and the other foot in the next, but we should use that energy of dissonance to propel us forward into the correct worldview rather than generate some type of creative fusion with the past. While morality can be applied in all dimensions of human interaction, some serious distinctions must be made, such as between harm and violence, and hurt and harm. In regards to the latter, hurt feelings doesn't necessarily mean you've been harmed by someone, and this is precisely what NVC is blind to, as it is based in feelings and needs rather than objective truth and morality, in which needs and feelings are subject to. People can be hurt due to their misperception, personal issues, psychological imbalances, and delusions, which are based on the lack of self-development and self-awareness, all of which NVC ignores. In terms of metaphysics, right and wrong exist in all relative planes of existence due to the law of polarity, and they just get more subtle the higher you go due to the law of vibration. But there is a clear division between harm of the mind and spirit and violence of the flesh. We must not see morality on a flat plane as a single-dimensional subject. Language does not remove one's freedom, imprison them, or holds them under duress. If I have said something that hurts you, I have not violated you or acted in violence against you. While we have the freedom to be wrong in thought and feeling and its expression in the inner subjective domain, we do not have the right to violate rights. We do not have the right to cross this line. While people do not have the right to murder, rape, and steal, they do have the freedom to say what they think and how they feel, even if what they say and feel is harmful and wrong. People can be mentally imbalanced and socially inappropriate, can have an emotional breakdown, get triggered and lash out, and even be angry when it is not warranted. These are mistakes people can make. Again, one can be wrong without violating another person's rights. In fact, just because a person does not steal, murder, or rape does not necessarily make them a moral person. And we leave out one's participation in the government, since complying with the government can be considered an act of self-defense against duress. There are immoral activities of a consensual and expressive nature that don't violate rights, especially in respect to people's character and its lack of virtue, such as the problems of honesty, integrity, respect, and responsibility, which inevitably harms other people through betrayal and deception. We are here to learn these lessons of morality, which involve the complexities of psychology and development. But one cannot learn the lessons under the state of control, and therefore we cannot force people to be good and never harm. Once we blur the line between language and action, we are on the path to destroying free speech. This is what is happening today with the social justice warriors, who consider hate speech anything that hurts someone's feelings. Take the feminist movement that wanted to ban the word bossy.
Being labeled something matters. By middle school,
girls are less interested in leadership than boys. And that's because they worry about being called bossy.
We need to tell them it's okay to be ambitious.
We need to help them lean in.
Words matter.
Let's just ban the word bossy.
Let's ban bossy. Ban bossy.
And the Canadian laws that prohibit the use of gender pronouns for transgender people.
And so what I'm suggesting to you is that if somebody says, I'm not going to use those words, are brought before the tribunal, the federal tribunal, and the tribunal then delivers an order for a payment of a fine and alternatively a non-monetary remedy, i.e. cease and desist order, an order to do something, to compel them to do something. And that person who's brought before the tribunal says, I'm not doing that. They will find themselves in contempt of court, and prison is the likely outcome of that process until they purge the contempt.
Free speech, but he's gonna hold the mic for me, okay?
All right, you can get.
Unless you want.
I mean, see, you see how silly you're coming in ready to fight.
Interesting that he's holding the mic.
All right, why don't you give her the mic? Let's.
Yeah, why don't you pass me the mic?
Big win. Okay.
So, you don't believe hate speech exists?
No.
And you.
The Supreme Court agrees with me, by the way.
Great. You and the rest of the people who are here with you, or who are supposed to be here with you, claim that people have a victimhood complex, and that anything regarding racism or sexism or whatever ism it is that we're talking about is fake news, and everybody's just out here wanting to be a victim, as if that's something, that people are saying, I wake up every morning and I say, wow, how can I be a victim despite Dave Rubin or Charlie Kirk? Where's the, do I have to get lynched? Does somebody have to, murder me? Does somebody have to, kill me? Does somebody have to physically harass me? What will it take for it to be hate speech? And when do I actually become a victim? When I'm dead?
All right, it's a great question. So first off, the Supreme Court has ruled that hate speech doesn't exist in that you can say whatever you want, short of yelling fire in a crowded theater or calling for direct violence to someone. So right now, you can say anything to me. You can literally say anything to me. I'm sure you're thinking of a couple things. And you can say whatever you want to me, and guess what? I'll survive. And that's the price that you have to pay to live in a free society. So let me kick it back to you.
So here we see a blatant example of a social justice warrior confusing violence and language that hurts somebody's feelings. And so Sam Rubin, unfortunately, is appealing to authority, when he says, the Supreme Court doesn't deem hate speech as violence. But we understand that hate speech isn't violence when we can make these distinctions between levels of reality and levels of harm. Censorship is clearly the path to tyranny.
It's a beautiful thing, the destruction of words.
Like the social justice warriors, New Agers are going to have a hard time seeing this distinction because they are not grounded in their physical reality and don't have nuance in their thinking. But the confusion is critical because without this distinction between violence and harm, statists will only desire to give more power to government to control us, as we see with hate speech and also with thought crimes. Anything humans deem violent is easily turned into laws, and prohibiting free speech laws have already been underway. When looking at harm in the spiritual level, there is the false authority of charlatans, gurus, creators of religions, and cults in disseminating spiritual misteachings that keeps one in spiritual bondage. The harm of the mental level can be mind control, manipulation in order to have power over you, verbal abuse, deliberately trying to destroy another person's self-esteem, like gaslighting, unwarranted attacks, name-calling, being mean and vicious, bullying, lying, dishonesty, and cheating. Here we have the dangerous narcissistic, psychopathic spectrum in the expression of power and control to the less psychotic and more common asshole and bitch. Harm is created when a person we care about behaves in this way or when we behave this way towards people we care about. This is why it's not truly a form of harm when a stranger says untrue mean things to you. This is more of an annoyance. The physical plane is much different than mind and spirit, and regards actions that we should never tolerate collectively as a species, which we should be in total consensus about. As without this understanding of this moral boundary, we are on the path to collective suicide. This involves the violation of rights and the destruction of freedoms, duress, coercion, theft, murder, kidnapping, and rape. That is the prime directive of government. Thus, when we discuss natural law anarchy, this is the violence we speak of, which should never be confused with the activities of free speech, as with NVC. It would have been better for NVC to call itself compassionate language, but the term nonviolence is hazardous, especially in the statist context. While the moral complexities of human interaction can be difficult to sort through, everyone should understand the basic principles of right and wrong action, of the objective difference between actions that cause harm to one's sovereignty and actions that don't. Lacking such knowledge cannot even allow us to live on this planet to learn the more subtle dimensions of morality as our life conditions become incredibly toxic, as with the control system. While someone may have said something rude to somebody, this should never be seen as comparable to the destruction of life and the creation of slavery. We see this with the blatant evil found in the order following of the military and police, who follow orders of the so-called higher authority to commit immoral actions, such as war, genocide, and the creation of a police state on a grand scale, and the destruction of freedom and theft on the small scale through the imposition of arbitrary laws that serve the ruling class. As long as humans have the choice of whom to interact with or not, communication is never a violation. In most cases, one chooses an unhealthy relationship as it is not forced upon them, in which the solution is to exercise free will to get out. We cannot apply the same rules of self-defense to end violence when we perceive it in language as if it were a physical violation, disregarding the exceptions of physical abuse, of course. And I have been told by someone with experience in an NVC cult that some people consider it acceptable to hit other people when they believe them to be communicating violence. A sloppy and undifferentiated definition of violence can actually cause physical violence from perceived verbal attacks, as we see with the social justice warriors.
There are more than two binaries.
I said there's male and females. How does that attack transgender?
Well, just how you're talking about it right now. And you're saying, and you're mocking.
I'm talking about your made up genders that don't exist. That you're they, and them, whatever. There's the she and he.
it's just really disgusting how, you just belittle what people want to call them, what they deserve, and how they see themselves.
If someone identifies as a cat, can they do that? There's lots of people who have that reality.
Don't agree with you. I think you're hateful.
NVC blurs the consensual lines with things like permission boundaries by saying we have the right to control when others can and cannot speak. If someone speaks to you and you didn't ask, this is not a violation. But that boundary is confused as NVC promotes the fusion of boundaries with the pathological feminine, which we will look at. Additionally, and also related to the New Age, is extreme hypersensitivity, which is just hyper-egoic identification, which is why sound waves of criticism and being held accountable can be perceived like getting hit in the face. Everything needs to validate the ego, which attaches itself to the feelings and needs in the undeveloped person. Until one outgrows ego identification to understand that morality is objective, he will not be able to be consistently accurate about his perceptions of violence, since ego and emotions bias reality to maintain itself, while the transformative person will change himself when not in alignment to truth. Without the inner alchemy of growth, in addition to proper thinking, one can and will make false moralistic judgments, and again, one has the freedom to do this even when those judgments are wrong. When Rosenberg criticizes moralistic judgments, he should be criticizing false moralistic judgments. But one can never determine what is true or false in judgment when under the spell of relativism. He should also be criticizing ego judgment over objective judgment or discernment. Ego judgment, whether the content is correct or incorrect, is when a bad spirit accompanies the judgment, one of righteousness, superiority, pride, the intent to put down another person's self-esteem, or play a competitive game of one-upmanship. This indeed creates harm, since it comes from egoic contraction, fear, ignorance, and not love. This is Rosenberg's partial truth. Truth should be delivered without ego attachment and with humility, since truth applies to all, and living a truth is no easy task. A desire to inflict punishment on someone who is wrong is the revenge of a dark spirit or a spirit not awakened, and this is obviously not compassion. But to associate the desire to punish with mental discernment and evaluation is clearly a fallacy. True compassion understands the pain of ignorance, of living in error, as there is no reason to inflict punishment on someone, as their own mistakes will cause them harm and bring about their own self-inflicted suffering. A compassionate spirit never gains joy from another person's misery. Discernment and compassion is the goal. The problem is that because Rosenberg does not make this differentiation, anyone who claims to have moral discernment will be automatically characterized with negative judgment. When a person's ego is involved in communication, yes, there is communication issues. The feelings of entitlement, superiority, pride, and condemnation are not good. When communication is based in the ego and self-loathing, then it will most likely cause harm, but not because of the methods being used in speaking, because of where a person is at in their consciousness, intention, and spirit. When we don't have self-respect, we don't respect others, but self-loathing is not something you can cure by changing language. While we learn natural law in the Trivium to develop the mind and ground it in reality, we must develop the spirit that perceives true interconnectedness with all the lessons and mistakes of evolution. From the spiritual perspective in which we understand that we have lived many lives, we gain compassion through self-knowledge, as we can only know the errors in others by knowing our own internal errors, as they all have a similar structure rooted in fear, ignorance, ego, and apathy. From the correct spirit, judgment does not polarize, separate, and condemn, or seek to control, because such judgment is based in knowledge and understanding, with the motive to evolve, not to corrupt. The masculine ego will play the game of being right, but the feminine ego will play the needs game. Both are imbalances and expressions of the undeveloped self. A developed person will not feel good or receive an ego payoff when he is right and another person is wrong, because the spirit of that is not good. It is not good to use the energy of another person's pain or error to feel good. Rosenberg can only see that the determinations of right and wrong are an ego game, where everyone loses. But it is only when people choose right over wrong that everyone wins. Living in denial, delusion, and ignorance only perpetuates falsehood that inevitably leads to suffering. Rosenberg says that the right and wrong dichotomy prevents the spirit of giving. But if you give without discernment, you will be victimized. This was a hard lesson I've had to learn. Sometimes the truth is the greatest gift you can give someone. Calling people out on their bullshit can be an act of love. Because if you are not living in alignment with truth, you will suffer. NVC conflates morality with negative emotions like guilt, shame, and duty, and seeks to eradicate them all, which coheres with the positive bias of the New Age. Like NVC, the New Age has polarized against religion, seeking to become free from punishment and reward, which they associate with guilt and the other negative emotions. It is true that morality of religions has been incredibly damaging, as they use heaven and hell, punishment and reward, as a system for control. Just look at the vengeful, jealous God of the Old Testament. And as a side note, our dominator hierarchy in business, politics, and military is also based in the false morality of reward and punishment. The problem is that when we confront our immorality, we should feel a degree of remorse and regret. We should feel bad when we hurt someone, as when our feelings are in alignment with truth, they are our moral compass. It is not guilt that is the problem, but false guilt, the guilt of self-loathing that the religions indulge in a masochistic way. Also, NVC lumps blame into the negative category of guilt, when in moral situations, blame simply means accountability, responsibility, and the knowledge of who initiated harm. Without this, there is no moral discernment. On the other hand, NVC claims to be about owning responsibility with your feelings and emotions, but on the other hand, it abdicates responsibility by claiming that there is never blame to a moral situation. Part of responsibility is owning what you did that caused harm, saying, I was wrong and I am sorry. And when you feel harmed by others and wish to reconcile the situation or friendship, to let them know. And those who are stuck in ego will experience the most pain in being wrong as they fight against the truth. But NVC prevents such a conversation by claiming that no one should ever criticize and that morality is merely how someone feels.
And first, I'd like to remind you of how jackals say thank you. You did a good job on that paper. You are a very kind person. You're a good dancer. Can you see why that's jackal? Moralistic judgments. Positive moralistic judgments are equally as violent in my estimation as negative ones. Namely, they reinforce the idea that the negative exists. If I say you're a kind person, I'm implying there's such a thing as an unkind person. I'm also implying that I'm the judge that knows the difference. So no more praise or compliments, okay? No more praise or compliments. Especially when you intend them as a reward. That's the ultimate dehumanization, to use thank you as a reward. To say it for the purpose of trying to reinforce something, to get the person to continue doing it. It's like sending what goes on at dog obedience school? See? Punishment and reward, see? So giving a compliment or praise for the purpose of reinforcement is giving the dog something to eat to reinforce it for something. People are not for that treatment. And it destroys the beauty of thank you. When people have to wonder, is this being said out of that energy?
Rosenberg is pointing out how flattery and compliments can be used to control people, which is true. But yet he himself claims that the purpose of NVC is getting what you want. He is merely playing a higher level pragmatic game that appears to be altruistic, but is still backed with a selfish agenda.
What could be more tragic than that, than expressing ourselves in a way that gets in the way of our getting what we want?
The big no-no word is you should. Right. So should is another one of the D's. I would say that's deserve-oriented thinking. So you want to, if possible, remove deserve. So deserve is you should, you ought to. And it's very much caught up in the realm of punishment and rewards.
Yeah.
Like you should be punished when you do bad things. You should be rewarded when you do good things.
Yeah.
And it leads to disconnection.
In this video, a person who is combining the Trivium and NVC claims that NVC is never using the word should or ought. But this can be moral language and not just an egoic demand. There are many things people should not do, like they should not violate rights. There is zero self-correction in NVC, which is a requirement of responsibility. Stay tuned for part 2.